Hmm. Oh. Ah. Oh. Uh-oh.
Ladies and gentlemen, the University of North Carolina will not be in attendance this evening. Therefore, Duke wins the national championship.
Hey, Lark and Rose here. One of the first things that people are concerned about when they start thinking about a society without a ruling class is, well, what happens to the nasty people? Whether you're talking about people who are just kind of negligent or inconsiderate, play their music too loud at night or leave their trash lying around the woods or whatever it is, all the way up to people who run around attacking and murdering people. So people say, well, what would happen to them? What would we do about that? Some people even go so far as to say, if not for government, there would be nothing to stop people from committing murder and doing whatever other nasty stuff. And it's funny because when somebody says that, there would be no consequences, they could do whatever they wanted and nobody would stop them, the person saying that is implying that he isn't going to do anything. If there's someone running around attacking and murdering innocent people, the guy who said nothing will happen to them, obviously he's not going to do anything or something would happen to them. But not only is he demonstrating his own cowardice when he said there would be nothing to stop murderers, he's also projecting his own immaturity and irresponsibility onto the rest of the world, because he's also saying the other 7 billion people wouldn't do anything about it, which obviously isn't true. I would, wouldn't you? If somebody was running around murdering your neighbors, would you just go, well, there aren't politicians and there's nobody with a badge and we don't have tax collectors and bureaucrats, so oh well, I guess they're just out of luck, they're going to get murdered. And would you not even protect yourself if there wasn't government? Obviously, lots and lots of people, all the sane people, would do whatever they could to protect themselves and defend the innocent. So to say nothing would happen is just really bizarre. And it comes from having a mentality basically of a little kid in a classroom, where the teacher walks out of the room and the kids are just sitting there. We don't know what to do. No authorities telling us what to do. And Johnny's throwing things at me. And there's no teacher to stop him. Ah! Because most people, having been trained into authoritarian mentality, it never occurs to them that they are the ones who should fix anything, who should stop anything. And so when people say, well, what would be done about this and that and the other thing, nasty people doing nasty things, the first thing I ask is, well, what would you do about it? Because people are so into the mentality that there has to be some master plan and some authority who writes down the law of here is what will be done with those people, that people don't think in terms of, well, what would I do about it? Which is why I always ask people, well, what would you do about it? You're a person just as much as me and just as much as the other 7 billion. What would you feel justified in doing if somebody was polluting or playing their music too loud at night or running around murdering people or whatever in between you can think of? Any nasty thing, what would you feel justified in doing about it? Because there's a very basic rule of being a moral human being, which is if it would be wrong for you to do something, don't ask anybody else to do it. And the rule is so simple, so self-evident and obvious that most people will go, well, duh, of course. Trouble is, nobody in the world who believes in government abides by that rule. Nobody. I don't care if you're a constitutionalist, Democrat, Republican, fascist, communist, anything, any kind of statist. There is nobody who believes in government who abides by the most basic rule of morality, which is if it's wrong for you to do something, don't ask somebody else to do it. Because every single candidate, every party, every government always does things that the voters know they themselves have no right to do. And to say something like, well, I'm voting for the guy who's going to tax you less. Well, do you have the right to rob me a little bit less than the other guy? No, you don't. So telling me that, well, somebody was going to rob you more, but I voted for the guy to rob you a little bit less, you are still violating the basic rule of being a human being. If it's wrong for you, don't ask somebody else to do it. Well, that's kind of the second basic rule, the first one being the non-aggression principle. And they actually go together quite well. But when people are in the mindset that there's going to be some major centralized plan to deal with whatever, polluters or people who play their music too loud or murderers or whatever else, they have to get out of that mindset. They have to start to think that maybe they are among the people who have to do something about it. So instead of saying, what will be done about such and such, well, what will you do about it? What should I do about it? And this doesn't magically make all the problems go away, but the actual practical challenge of dealing with most disputes is trivial compared to the challenge of getting people to think like responsible adults, where they start to think, well, maybe it's up to me. And a while back I did little events called Escaping the Myth, and one of the little mental exercises I did with these little groups of people is, imagine we're on an island and we're it. There's no government, there's no authority, there's nobody with a badge, and one of us is running around stealing stuff from other people. He's not killing anybody, but he's stealing stuff. What are we going to do about it? We normal people. There's not a legislature, there's not 911 to call, there's nobody with a badge, it's just people. And so with that specific example, I would ask people, so what do we do? And just off the top of their heads, everybody comes up with solutions that are way better than what government ever does. First of all, every government solution is, all right, step one, I get to rob everybody. That's the government solution. Well, we're going to tax everybody so we have the resources to stop that other robber. Well, in the island scenario, nobody is stupid enough or insane enough to start with that, to say, well, let's see, so somebody's stealing our stuff. Okay, first, I get to rob all of you so that I have the resources to protect you from him. Nobody is that insane. Everybody is insane enough to believe that who believes in government. And I did for many years. I was stupid enough to actually think that it was rational and moral to advocate mass extortion in order to protect people. And that's just stupid. So I just believed something insanely stupid for a very long time. Most of the world still believes that. But in a setting where people are put on the spot and they're responsible for what happens, they don't do that. They don't say, well, I get to boss everybody around and take their money. Nobody does that. So to me, the challenge is not even coming up with specific solutions to every imaginable dispute or problem, which I don't pretend to know how everything's going to turn out. And I don't intend to be emperor of anarchy. I'm not going to be in charge of the world. But getting people to the mindset where it's up to them, where there's just people, we're it. No legislatures, no people with badges, no authority, we're just people. Suddenly people are way better at solving problems and making things work. One good example is when there's a disaster. Unfortunately, sometimes it takes a horrendous event to bring out the best in people. And it brings out the worst in some people too. But when people say, whoa, my neighbor's house is floating away, I'm not going to wait for FEMA. I'm not going to dial 911. I'm going to jump in a boat and go save him. Because suddenly it's on me. Suddenly I'm the one who has to do something. And when it occurs to people that they're the ones who have to do something, and unfortunately usually that only happens in a complete disaster area, when it occurs to people and they suddenly take on the responsibility and start to think like adults, their solutions are generally a lot better than any government solutions and ever are. But to get to that mentality, people have to shift from the authoritarian mindset to the mindset of a self-owning individual who realizes there is nothing above me. There is no magic unicorn who's going to come to save the day, who's going to come save me from polluters or somebody playing their music too loud or murderers or whatever it is. It's just us. And if we realize that, then first of all, people would stop asking me, well, without a government, how would this be handled? As if I'm going to be in charge. I don't freaking know. What would you do about it? I can tell you what I would do about it. I could tell you what I might suggest, what I might predict, but who cares? I'm one of 7 billion people. I'm not going to be in charge any more than you are. So it's really a mental exercise that people have to think over in their own heads with their own moral codes instead of waiting for some outside answer. And it's why I don't usually get into those discussions of, well, here's my plan for how to deal with this and that and the other thing, because my plan doesn't matter. My plan will not be the best plan for any problem you can come up with. There will be a million people with better plans than whatever I could come up with. So don't ask me to describe how you are going to fix problems. I don't freaking know. And you can see the mind shift in people when they grasp that they own themselves and they suddenly realize, oh, okay, well, yeah, there are things we can do to settle disputes, to protect ourselves from attackers, to do this or that or the other thing. But the first step is just grow up. Stop thinking it's somebody else's business to make the world work. Well, how will the poor be cared for? I don't know. What are you going to do? Well, how will we be protected from this? I don't know. What are you going to do about it? And it is inconvenient. It's inconvenient to be a free person where you can't just be a kid in a classroom whining to the teacher to save the day and fix everything and make everything work, where you actually have to be a responsible adult. And that's one of the main reasons why people like the belief in authority, because then they can live with the lie that all they have to do is obey and do as they're told and everything will be okay. First of all, no, it won't be okay. Second of all, you're not even being a human being. You just threw your free will out the window and became somebody's slave in the hopes that that would help humanity. It doesn't help humanity for you to be a slave. It doesn't help humanity for everybody else to be a slave. It does help humanity for you to start thinking as an adult, responsible human being who owns himself and who accepts that it is your responsibility to figure out how to make the world work. This video is for all the people who are constantly saying, well, if not for government, we couldn't have roads, or we couldn't have police, or nobody would care for the poor, or we wouldn't be protected, whether it's from local thugs or from foreign invaders. We wouldn't have this, we wouldn't have that. So thank goodness we have government and taxes, because we wouldn't have any of those things. And the first way I'd respond to that is by pointing out the assumptions that underlie that complaint, that argument. Basically what people are saying, because let's be clear about what the terms mean, government is the people who boss everybody else around. And taxes are those people demanding money from us. So they basically tell us, hand over a whole bunch of money and we'll decide how to take care of you. We'll decide how to spend your money. If we don't like it, too bad, we don't really have a choice. Like, well, you can vote in a few years and maybe something will change, even though it totally won't. So that's what people are saying. Basically, if we didn't have a ruling class stealing our money and then supposedly spending it to protect us, how could we possibly have roads or anybody to protect us? The implication is that in this country, for example, 300 million people would just sit around thinking, oh, we can't do it. Without politicians and tax collectors, we can't have a road, we can't protect each other, and we can't... And it rests on this bizarre assumption that things that almost everybody wants, they wouldn't do anything to make happen unless there were politicians forcing us to give them money so they can make it happen. And so an example I like to use is, let's apply the same argument to food, because food is pretty darn important. I think everybody can agree. Let's apply the same argument that statists use about the roads or caring for the poor or protection or anything like that. The argument would go like this. Now, in the context of food, listen how idiotic this is. If we don't have government demanding money from all of us under the threat of caging us, and that's what taxation is, here's the money you have to give us, here's the nasty things we do to you if you don't. If that didn't happen so that they could build a big food production and distribution system and feed us, well, we'd all starve. We'd all just sit around saying, gosh, I wish we had food, but no politicians and tax collectors. We're just going to sit around and starve to death. Now, in this country, nobody would believe something that stupid, because all you have to do is go to a supermarket and see a perfect example of really efficient, organized cooperation that nobody is forced to do. There is no, if you're going to make the argument that people make about roads and protection and all that, you'd say, well, Nobody is forced to make any food for anybody in this country. How do you know everyone's just going to say, well, it's not my job, and we'll all starve to death? There's no guarantee. There's no master plan guaranteeing that we'll all have food. So obviously we're all going to starve if we don't have an authoritarian government stealing our money and then making food and giving it to us. Because golly gee, we couldn't possibly do it voluntarily ourselves. Again, in this country, nobody makes that argument because they see it happening voluntarily. Nobody involved is forced to do that. Nobody is forced to make you a single bite of food. There is no guarantee at all from anybody. And yet, Americans are, by and large, hugely overweight. Obviously, we don't have a lack of food. We might have a lack of healthy food. But obviously, we see that example, oh, we can handle that. You know, voluntarily, mutual cooperation, that's fine for food, but for some reason, it's not okay, and we can't even fathom the idea of the exact same thing handling roads, or handling protecting us, or other things that almost everybody wants. So there's, in the question, is this bizarre assumption that everybody will sit around really, really, really wanting something, but because there aren't politicians bossing us around and stealing our money, well, how could we possibly do it? And one of the most common things is, who will build the roads? Which is amazingly stupid to me. Just amazingly stupid. I have here in my pocket a little tiny thing. With this little tiny thing, I can be most places in this country and call people all over the world. And I own it myself. I'm not anywhere near rich these days, but I own one. Almost everybody I know has one of these. A little thing that can fit in your pocket, and just on a whim, you can open it and talk to somebody who's on the other side of the planet. And there was no coercion. Nobody forced anybody to make one of these. This is the result of voluntary cooperation. And that's it. Free trade. Organization, yeah, good. Cooperation, yeah, good. Coercion, which is what government is, and taxation, which is theft, didn't need that to do this. So what these people are telling me, oh, we wouldn't have roads if we didn't have government, is that somehow free individuals, relatively free, interacting voluntarily can make it so I can talk to almost anybody in the world on a little thing that fits in my pocket on a budget that is not a very good budget at the moment, but I still have one of these. That freedom, not authoritarianism, can supply me with this, but freedom cannot achieve a flat place. Because that's what a road is. It's a flat place. From here to there, because we have these machines that take us from here to there. By the way, we don't have those machines because of government. We have those machines because of free enterprise and voluntary interaction and cooperation. The idea that freedom can make a car but can't make a flat place is just idiotic. You really think we can't make a flat place? And so I ask people when they say, well, who will build the roads? Are you really telling me that you really and truly think that if government fell off the face of the earth, 300 million people in this country, 7 billion if you want to include the whole planet, would sit around in their houses thinking, golly, I wish I could go visit Fred, but I can't because there's not a flat thing for me to him, and I don't know how to do it. And the other 300 million or 7 billion people, we can't possibly do it because there aren't any politicians and tax collectors. If they were here, we could do it. If they were here to boss us around and steal our money and really inefficiently build a flat place, then we'd be set. Then I'd be comfortable and I could be confident that I could get places. I could visit Fred, I could go shopping, but now we're all going to sit in our houses wishing we could go to the corner store, but we can't because, golly, how could we possibly make a flat place from here to there? We can make these, where you can talk to anybody in the world. We can make machines that you drive around in, but no, we couldn't possibly make a flat place. And when people say, well, who will build the roads? The first answer is the same damn people who do it now. Politicians and tax collectors don't build the friggin' roads. Have you ever seen one out there? No, you haven't. They steal our money, waste most of it, do all their corrupt games, and then they pay other people. Here's an idea. How about if we pay those other people who actually build the stinking road? And the fact that that doesn't occur to people is a great indication of how well indoctrinated people are by the rulers who will perpetually tell us, you can't organize anything, you can't achieve anything, you can't do anything unless we are here to force it on you. And it's, again, there are a zillion examples, whether it's caring for the poor or protection or roads, obviously, where most of the population will say, I'm really concerned that poor people won't be taken care of, which means most of the population wants people in need to be taken care of. And if we didn't have politicians stealing our money, how would it happen? Here's an idea. Take some money out of your pocket and give it to one of the people that you think needs help. Why would you not comprehend that, but you would comprehend some guy 1,000 miles away passing a law to send an armed thug to take your money, to waste 90% of it, and then give a little bit to somebody who may just be defrauding the system or may actually need it? And the amount of indoctrination required to make people even ask these questions of how could we possibly do this without government? What do you think government adds to the equation? It doesn't add any resources. It doesn't create anything. Everything it gives away, it steals from us first, by way of taxation. It doesn't add any skills. It doesn't add any knowledge. The people who are here would still be here if the institution of government fell over. We have all the know-how, we have all the resources, all the technology. The only thing it adds is one group that's imagined to have the right to violently assault and control and extort everybody else. So what the question really means is, how could we have a road, or how could I help that poor, or how could that poor person be helped, or how would anybody protect us if there wasn't a gang of thugs with permission to violently control and rob us? And when you recognize that that is literally what the question means, you already see how utterly idiotic it is. And it's completely the result of authoritarian statist indoctrination. Nobody would come up with that on their own. And you obviously don't see that with the example of food or cars or cell phones or anything else. Nobody says, we won't be able to talk to each other unless there's a gang of thugs that's allowed to boss us around and steal our money. And just economically, how stupid you have to be to think that's a good idea. Here are your choices. Let's do this. I'll give you these two choices for how you will be fed from now on. Either you can go spend your own money wherever you want. You can go to the supermarket or the local this or the local grocery, whatever you want. You can go decide what you want, and they'll tell you the price. You decide what you're going to buy and how much. And you can go to different places and you can shop around and you can do all that. That's option number one. But let me warn you, option number one does not give any guarantee that you will be fed. There's no master plan forcing people to feed you. So, oh my gosh, you better be really scared of that option, despite the fact that you can do it day after day and it works really darn well and feeds pretty much not only this country, but with a massive surplus. So that's option number one that apparently statists are scared of. Option number two is politicians will take as much money of yours as they decide to take. Then they will decide what, if anything, they will buy with that money in terms of food to give to you, to feed you. Do you really think that will serve you better, that will feed you better? Yeah, I'm much more comfortable that I'll have I'll be fed, I'll be secure, everything will be okay. If a gang of thugs who doesn't really care about me steals my money and then decides what, if anything, to give me back from what they stole. But that is implied in the question, whatever you put in the blank. How are we going to have blank if not for government? What you're saying is, how can we, the people who really want roads and food and cell phones and protection and all the things that almost everybody wants, how can we possibly have that unless we give someone permission to steal our money and boss us around and then decide what they're going to give us? And the same thing applies no matter what you put in the blank. How will we possibly do blank without government? One of the silly ones is caring for the poor. How will we care for the poor? Think of what that means. Like when more than half the country votes for a party to take care of the poor, it's more than half of the country saying, we're really concerned and we want to make sure that the less fortunate are taken care of, but we don't believe that normal people acting in freedom will take care of them. Well, if the people didn't care about the poor, they wouldn't win the election. By definition, if you vote for a welfare state, you're an idiot. Because either people are heartless bastards and you're going to lose, or people are compassionate and giving and you don't need to win. Just give them your stinking money. But people play the game, and that's the Democratic Party lives off of the idiotic notion that you're all so heartless that you should vote for us to steal your money to give to the poor. And half the country falls for it. Yeah, we're all so heartless that we voted you into office for the specific purpose of taking our money to help the less fortunate. That's just freaking brilliant. How about if half the country just gave their stinking money to the less fortunate? And then the less fortunate would all be rich, because it would be 1 trillion times more efficient than the government version of welfare ever is. Also, it would be actual charity instead of mass theft and corruption and fraud and all that fun stuff. But what takes the cake, the ultimately insane thing, whatever you put in that gap, how can we have blank without a parasitic ruling class and a bunch of hired thieves? It's just a stupid question, but it's extra super stupid when what's in the blank is, how will we be protected? Who will protect us from thieves and robbers if we don't have government? It's the most idiotic question. It's also the most frequent question from statists. So here's what the question literally means. If we don't give a certain gang of people permission to violently control us and take our money under threat of putting us in a cage, who will protect us from people who might commit aggression against us and take our money? Wanting government for that is exactly as brilliant as saying, we have to have a carjacker in our town, otherwise somebody might steal our cars. Government is an appointed thief. If you don't think taxation is theft, first of all, you're a really well-trained slave. Second of all, try not paying, see what happens. See if they say, oh, it's quite all right. Or if they say, no, you're going to pay, or we're going to take your stuff, or eventually we'll put you in a cage. And when people say, that's not theft, because we get something back. Learn to think. And I use this example all the time, and all I ever get is stupid looks from statists in response. If I robbed you at gunpoint of $100, and the next day I gave you a sandwich, and you said, what? I said, hey, now everything's fine, because you benefited. I gave you a service. I gave you lunch, so that retroactively makes it okay that I robbed you at gunpoint. Would you buy that argument? No, you'd say, that doesn't make it okay. I don't care that you gave me a sandwich. And yet every statist makes the exact same argument when it comes to government. Well, we get some stuff for it after they demand our money under threat of violence and putting us in a cage. Then we get services or goods. And we don't get what we asked for, and we get lots of things we didn't ask for. But we kind of get something, and that retroactively makes it okay for them to say, give us this much of every paycheck you make, or we're sending men with guns to take your property. And the slaves justify their own enslavement. I'm proud to pay my taxes. I'm proud to get robbed by a parasitic ruling class and get a little bit back and feel good about it. Like, not only is that legitimate and justified, but I feel proud that I let myself get robbed by a bunch of crooks and parasites. But again, the ultimate thing is protection. When people say, who will protect us from aggressors and thugs and thieves if we don't have a government? Even though what government is, by its very nature, is a gang of aggressors and thugs and thieves. They issue commands. Every law they pass is a command backed by a threat of violence. You have to do this. You're not allowed to do that. Here are the nasty things we will do to you if you get caught disobeying. I mean, everybody knows that, even though they don't usually say it in terms that blunt and honest and accurate. But to say we need taxes to be protected is as stupid as you can get. It's saying we need theft to avoid theft. And the fact that people are trained to use different words so that this theft sounds okay. It's legalized, it's taxation, and we voted for the people who robbed us. Like, we got to elect our local carjacker, and that means he represents us when he demands our car and points a gun in our face. He's serving us as he steals our car, because he's going to use that car and sell it and make money to make sure nobody else steals our car. That is the essence of government. And the fact that you have hundreds of millions of victims of that scam vehemently defending it and saying, I'm not going to give that up. I don't want to give up government. Who would protect us? I don't want to give up the biggest aggressor on the planet, the biggest thief on the planet, Look at your tax bill and see how much private crooks steal from you. So before you ask that question, before you ask, how could we possibly have roads or protection or water or air or Christmas or Santa Claus or any of the zillion things that statists imagine we can't possibly have without a ruling class, think about what the question actually means. Because when you get to the point where you understand the implications of your own question, asking, how can we possibly have this without a parasitic gang of thugs robbing us? When you actually understand what you're really asking, you won't ask the question because you will realize it's completely freaking idiotic.
Could we survive without rulers, without the state? We have survived for centuries despite them and their destructive wars and stifling oppression. Crippling taxes suck half our wealth away, sprinkling just a fraction back. It has been done before. Archaeology shows some of our ancestors living in peace for a few thousand years before armed rulers appear on the scene. Not in caves, but in cities with tens of thousands enjoying civilization we would recognize. What would life be like without the state? Less complicated, divisive, and confusing for a start. Poverty would be slashed with half our wealth back in circulation and none wasted on wars and political schemes. Enterprise and innovation flourish without the regulation that favors large corporations. We do things voluntarily, never because we are threatened with damage for non-compliance. It is a climate in which our cooperative and charitable nature can flourish. When joined up in a free system, we find effective ways to meet our community's needs. We develop systems in which cream rises to the top instead of scum. Online vendors value their reputations. Civilization developed through the connection and cooperation of people. We are more connected now than at any time in human history.
Mark Passio, I would embrace the ideas of anarchism, but I am so worried about the poor. Government currently helps the poor. In the absence of government, the poor might not be helped. Mark, how do you respond?
This is essentially the advocacy of theft, because to say that someone must contribute any amount of the product of their labor, but through coercion, is to make a claim on the product of the labor of that being. And by doing so, you are indirectly making a claim on that which produced that product of labor, which is the body itself. So once again, anyone advocating for taxation, redistribution of wealth, taking from the rich to give to the poor, etc., is advocating for theft. If something is not done voluntarily, it is done only through coercion and duress, which is violence in and of itself. So all we are here advocating here today, Keith, is that we don't want people to initiate violence to others just to get done in the world what they think should get done. If it gets done, it has to get done on a voluntary basis. And, you know, for people who have such a dark worldview of other people that don't think if people kept more of the product of their labor that they would be more charitable, they really haven't really studied the dynamic or the data at all. They just have a belief system about it. And really, that's all that the government really is in any of its forms or in any of its decrees or enactments or the ways that it does things. It is a religious institution. And that's how people have to really start seeing government. They need to see it as a religion, no different than any other religion, except for the fact that it's actually more violent and has even caused more death through democide than almost any other religious institution on the face of the earth.
Larkin Rose, I care about the poor, and that's why I don't embrace libertarianism or anarchism. Larkin, how do you respond?
There's so many people who just, they know what they know. They know the life they're in, what they're familiar, what they've seen, and they have a hard time imagining or predicting things otherwise. So literally, if you stuck them in a cage and gave them a bowl of gruel every day and kept them that way for 10 years, and somebody opened the cage door, some of them would say, how do I know there's going to be food out there? Like, I have my bowl of gruel, I have my roof over my head, not a great roof, but a roof. because that's all they've seen. And so government will use that to control something and then say, without us, this wouldn't be the case. So if you look at the Soviet Union, you know, they can say, you wouldn't have any food if not for us. You have to stand in bread lines and maybe get a little bit of moldy garbage after a few hours. But without us, you wouldn't have any. Well, that lie doesn't work in the U.S. because we have supermarkets and you can go there and buy all sorts of food. But government is always trying to take over areas of society and then tell us this wouldn't happen without us. Never mind that, you know, when it comes to the poor, in spite of being robbed by the ruling class, Americans are ridiculously generous to the tunes of billions of dollars a year. And all of the taxation and regulation that gets in the way of helping people have places to live and food and everything, it's just a matter of government literally interfering with us voluntarily finding solutions and then saying, see, this is why we can't have a voluntary society, because you couldn't solve these. Never mind, they are the reason they can't be voluntarily solved right now, because agents of the state with guns will stop you from solving it and then say, that's why you need us.
Mark, don't we need to have at least some government to protect consumers and to protect employees, maybe protect employers sometimes from foreign competition? Don't we need some sort of base societal protection? Mark, how do you respond?
I mean, that's basically the argument of saying, don't we need some slavery to keep society moving in any one particular direction? All government is immoral because it is the idea that certain people have the right to issue commands to other people, and that those other people have some sort of a moral obligation to follow the commands of this dictatorial ruling class. On its face, this is the major paradigm shift that people have to make, and this is actually a spiritual shift in consciousness, believe it or not, is to understand that the concept of government is on its face inherently immoral, because the entirety of the concept of the institution is based upon coercion, violence, and keeping people in the state known as duress, which is the state of threat of violence. This is how government generally rules, is through threat of violence. You know, how much people say, oh, there's less violence in the world today than there ever was. Physically, that may be the case, but guess what? There's probably more duress. There is more threat of violence if there is not compliance with government decrees than at any other time in the world. See, the people who are advocating for all of these things, even minarchism, are ultimately advocates of coercion, violence, and duress. And we have to keep going back to that simple concept. And they cannot argue a different position if they actually are honest about what the behaviors that they advocate are. If you actually put their feet to the fire and say, please explain to me what this behavior would ultimately have to look like in the physical 3D world, they would describe a situation where enforcers or armed individuals come and command the compliance with the decrees of their political overlord masters. There is no way around it for them logically. They would have to explain it like that if they're being honest with themselves. So that's what I say to all minarchists and those who advocate just for keeping government as a protectorate or something of that nature. It's still claiming that you can give rights that the individual does not possess. If none of us have $1,000 to give to anyone, we cannot all come together and give the non-existent $1,000 to anyone else. Rights cannot be conferred, granted, or transacted to other individuals if those who are making the claim that they're doing that don't have that right themselves. So if we look at what people would say they want to keep government for, even in a minarchist terminology, in a minarchist point of view, if they don't have the right to do those things individually, they cannot be granted to anyone else to do and magically call it a right when in fact it is a wrongdoing based in violence.
Larkin, don't we need government for consumer regulation, employee regulation, and some foundation societal structure?
When people say, well, we still need government for this, whatever it is, whatever they finish that sentence with, what they're saying is, well, in this case, we need to have some people committing violent aggression in a way that the rest of us have no right to do. We need some people to not be bound by morality, basically. They're allowed to be violent thugs. And whatever the problem, whether you're talking about, poverty or consumer protectionism or the environment or yada, 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 whatever it is, including real problems, the notion that the answer is to tell somebody you get to make a decision, come up with a plan, and violently impose it on the rest of us in a way that none of us have the right to do, as if that's going to make it better, is a perfect example of why I say advocates of government are immature in their minds. It's literally a matter of, we're not sure how we would handle this, so we want big daddy government or big mommy government handling it because we're not sure what it would look like otherwise. But to jump to saying, well, this is why we need government, is literally saying this is why we need to add immoral, violent aggression into society just for this thing over here, just to take care of the poor or to protect us from this. No, we don't. In no case do we need to, nor should we, add immoral violence into society. And that is all that the belief in government adds, is the impression that violent aggression can sometimes be legitimate. And I don't mean defensive force, I mean aggression against innocents. The belief in government relies entirely on the notion that can be legitimate to initiate violence against somebody who didn't do anything to you. No, we don't need that insanity.
And same for the roads and everything,
Yeah,
right?
so I mean, just think of people think of
Like-
roads as some
Yeah, most people,
arcane,
whenever I, say all these things, they're like, who will build the roads? And
Yeah, so most
that is their major concern.
most people think roads are like this arcane secret that's been kept by only some private companies, that only they have the knowledge to build these roads, and if they went away, or if the government went away, then that knowledge would just disappear and we would not know how to build roads. Like my good friend just shared a picture yesterday. He has a private sort of community that he's building in Pune, and he's building his own road right now. So that's a real thing. I tell you, without the government, we would build the roads. It's just that the reason people ask that question is they can't comprehend that. Okay, for example, let's say we want to build a road in this area, and everyone agrees, but this one idiot, who's over there, he basically says, no, I don't want this road to come here. So roads don't only build in a straight line. You can always go above his property or you can go below his property. And you can always ostracize him for that. You can basically make this list and say, this idiot came in the way of our road and we had to go to this inconvenience and people had to pay a little more for that. And you can stop him from using your road. If he's against your road, then it's your private property. You can stop him from using it. So people would have the incentives to actually go ahead with things and pay for things. And it's not like that problem goes away right now. So if you look in the current system right now as well, it's not like everyone agrees to have their properties taken away. Like if the government wants to come and do some project over here next to my house, and if I have to give up my house, it's not like I agree with that. But the government has eminent domain, so it's just gonna come and kick me out and possibly give me some shitty remuneration somewhere else, or somehow somewhere else, which I don't really want. But I don't have an option. So just because people are being forced to get off right now, and it just becomes easy for them to forcefully move people out and be able to build their road or the infrastructure project or the airport or whatever they want to do, doesn't mean that you're not violating someone else's rights. So in a world without government, we would still have these people who would have these problems with their property being taken away or not. But the incentives would be obviously much more to go ahead with a protect than to not, for the reasons I said. And if someone doesn't like a certain road, there are always multiple ways to get to one place. So if you don't like say this road builder, for example, he has too much surveillance on his road. He has too many CCTVs. I wouldn't want to go and use this road. So I'll probably just take another road. There's always multiple ways to get to one place. Someone can always build a flyover. Someone can always go underground. So you don't restrict yourself to that opportunity. As long as you're not infringing on anyone else's rights, you can build property wherever you like. So, that's how these things would tend to work out. And we've had examples of private roads in the past. There have been turnpike roads in the USA where, private merchants have got together basically and say, for example, we're a shop. We're a bunch of shops in this area. We don't have a road right now. It's obviously an incentive for us. If we are going to fund a road over here, more people are going to pass. And they're more likely to come in our shop and buy stuff. So, these kinds of incentives will always be there for people to come in of a crowdfunding, community funding thing. Like, someone starts an initiative that they want to, not just a road, but for anything. Like, people will come and chip in, and it's not always going to be fair. Like, you might have someone who doesn't want to pay for it. But since it's private property, you can always decide, like, if someone doesn't want to pay for it, they won't get to use the service. And if they're okay with that, that's fine. I mean, you have to deal with that. So I think these are some of the ideas with how the roads would tend to work out, and it's not like I'm just giving basic ideas. But look, the legal system, police, military, roads, all these things that we can't think how without government would function. People have written entire books on this. Like Walter Block has done 3 books on water capitalism, on privatizing roads and highways. He's even like done his last book on privatizing space. So people have written lengthy books with tons of footnotes that you can go and dig into for exactly how these things would work out and how we would make them work.
Again, men are angels. The state is irrelevant one way or the other. But if men are not angels and there's no state, we will have a bad situation. We would be fools to argue that if we simply got rid of the state, we would produce heaven on earth. That's not the nature of the human raw material. Some of us are no damn good. Okay? And that seems to be a condition that, try as we may, we can't change. So it's always going to be the case that in society are some individuals that are inclined to criminal actions and aggression against their fellows. And that has to be dealt with somehow. So if we have no state to deal with it, we will definitely have a bad situation. However, I maintain that if we do have a state purportedly to deal with it, we will have a worse situation. Okay? Although I admit that the outcome in a stateless society will be bad, because not only are people not angels, but many of them are irredeemably vicious in the extreme, I conjecture that the outcome in a society under a state will be worse, indeed much worse. Because, first, the most vicious people in society will tend to gain control of the state. And second, by virtue of this control over the state's powerful engines of death and destruction, they will wreak vastly more harm than they ever could have caused outside the state. It is unfortunate that some individuals commit crimes, but it is stunningly worse when such criminally inclined individuals wield state powers. Lest anyone protest that the state's true function or duty or end is, as Locke, Madison, and countless others have argued, to protect individual rights to life, liberty, and property, the evidence of history clearly shows that, as a rule, real states do not behave according to that ideal. The notion that states actually function along such lines, or that they strive to carry out such a duty or to achieve such an end, resides in the realm of wishful thinking. Although some states, in their own self-interest, may at some times protect some residents of their territories, other than the state's own functionaries, such protection is at best highly unreliable and all too often nothing but a solemn farce. Moreover, it is invariably mixed with crimes against the very people the state purports to protect, because the state cannot even exist without committing the crimes of extortion and robbery, which states call taxation. And, as a rule, of course, this crime is but the merest beginning of the state's assaults on the lives, liberties, and property of the resident population.
Now, Mark, you have been very critical of the police. However, I guess no one's told you that they're just doing their job and they don't make the laws. Congress makes the laws, for heaven's sake. Mark, why are you so critical of police when they don't make the laws and they're just doing their job?
Well, the SS, the Schutzstaffel, the highest levels of the Nazi Wehrmacht High Command in Nazi Germany, also issued orders, and the people who were undergoing war crimes tribunals at Nuremberg offered that same excuse, the Nuremberg defense, and it didn't work there because there is no excuse for following immoral orders. If someone is commanding you and saying we're giving you an order to go and suppress someone else's natural rights through coercion and violence, the answer is you have to say no and or quit that job. See, I don't really believe that there is any use or reason for police forces to exist because I believe in total personal responsibility. That means that each individual should take it upon themselves for their own defense because no one is closer to your own body than you. First of all, it is impossible for someone else to actually engage in self-defense for another individual because you can never get there faster than the individual themselves. This is one of the first and foremost principles of all martial arts, including self-defense with firearms. So I don't think that we should try to give any group of people a special select group of rights that we say that other people don't possess, because as soon as you do that, you're creating a differential in power, and that's always going to be abused by people who are flawed human beings. And it's a fundamentally flawed axiomatic idea from the very beginning, from Jump Street. That is a flawed axiomatic idea to say anyone else should be personally responsible for your self-defense. No, you need to be personally responsible for your self-defense and learn self-defense techniques through martial arts and the usage of firearms.
Larkin, are the police responsible for enforcing immoral laws?
Absolutely. And as much as I talk about how voters and advocates of government think like children, that is even more true of cops and enforcers. The ironic thing is they pretend to be, we're the tough, rugged bad guys keeping you. They are physically and intellectually the most immature people there are. Because when you challenge them and say, you're doing something immoral, they say, I'm just doing what I'm told. It's like a little kid in classroom. The teacher told me to do this, so I'm doing it. And, I can't be expected to have a conscience or a brain or the ability to distinguish right from wrong or take responsibility for what I am personally doing. It really is the most cowardly and evil thing anybody can do, to give away their own judgment and conscience and free will and blindly obey some imaginary outside authority. And that's what cops and soldiers are.
Another common but incorrect assumption is that if there were no government, people would have no way to defend against criminals or foreign invaders. But one does not need a badge or special authority to have the right to defend himself or others against attackers and thieves. Everyone already has the right to use defensive force on his own or with others for mutual protection. Anarchy means no one has the right to rule, i.e., no one has special rights. It doesn't mean people can't get together to exercise rights that everyone already has. In a stateless society, even professional protectors would only have the same rights as everyone else. Another concern that some people have is that if there were no government, then smaller, private gangs would spring up to rob, oppress, and enslave people. There are a couple of reasons why this fear is misguided. First of all, even private street gangs and organized crime today exists mainly because of government, not in spite of it. Notice how many gangs today get their funding from trading in illegal black markets, drugs, gambling, prostitution, guns, etc., which were all created by government laws. In a free society, thugs and thieves, individually or in gangs, wouldn't have any black markets to take over. More importantly, people who fear that without government, warlords would take over are ignoring how much people's perceptions matter. A criminal gang which everyone recognizes as illegitimate and immoral has far less power than a gang whose aggression is perceived to be legitimate and legal, its commands and demands being called laws and taxes, and any who disobey being seen as criminals. In other words, a population is far more likely to be oppressed by a gang which the people themselves imagine to have the right to rule than by some gang that everyone knows is bad and that everyone would feel perfectly justified in disobeying and resisting even forcibly. Imagine a private gang trying to do what government now does, extorting and bossing everyone around. But imagine if they tried that without any aura of legal authority. Then imagine how a well-armed population would respond. The gang would fail quickly and dramatically, and all those who resisted them would be viewed as righteous heroes. But when the people feel morally obligated to obey the politicians' laws, anyone who resists are viewed as criminals or tax cheats, even by their own friends and neighbors. Most people see government domination as necessary and valid, and so they cooperate with their own victimization. That is why government gets away with far more oppression and extortion than private gangs ever could, because most of the victims of legal thuggery and theft see it as necessary and legitimate. Millions of people tolerate the confiscation of a huge portion of their earnings and tolerate having many of their choices and behaviors forcibly limited and controlled by way of legislation, as long as the people giving the orders are seen as a legitimate political authority. But in a situation where the people don't accept the idea that someone else has the moral right to rob them and rule them, the people stop cooperating and start resisting. This is why the presence of government drastically increases the chances of people getting robbed. In fact, increases the chances 100%, since every government taxes the people it pretends to represent. Meanwhile, the lack of an authoritarian ruling class makes the people far less susceptible to being extorted and dominated, and far more likely to disobey and resist any would-be thieves and thugs. To put it another way, warlords already did take over, called themselves government, and convinced their victims that it was righteous and necessary for the warlords to dominate and exploit everyone else for their own good. Relying on government to prevent theft and oppression is completely ridiculous, since government is the biggest thug and thief there is, confiscating far more wealth than all other crooks and criminals combined. And government protection is always hypocritical. Government law enforcers may sometimes find and lock up some private thugs and thieves, but every government also commits legalized theft and extortion itself and calls it taxation, while insisting that it needs to do that in order to protect the people from theft and extortion. As patently absurd as that is, most people still accept it without question. When someone first considers the idea of a stateless society, he may also worry that the people who are truly malicious, destructive and sociopathic, and there are such people in the world, would be free to do anything they pleased with no one to stop them. But this concern is again based on a basic misunderstanding of human nature. People who are willing to victimize others by their very nature don't care about morality or right and wrong. They don't care if what they are doing is right, and they also don't care if what they are doing is legal. They care only whether they can get away with harming others. In some instances, a would-be crook or thug might be deterred or stopped by force or by the threat of force, whether by someone with a badge or by someone without one. What makes this deterrence work is not the legislation or the official badges, but the simple threat of harm to the crook. A sociopath doesn't care about laws or social rules. He cares only about avoiding pain and hardship for himself. And that is true regardless of whether government exists or not. It makes no difference whether the threat comes from the police or another citizen or even another criminal. Discouraging nasty people from hurting others does not require special authority, only the ability and willingness to use defensive force. If the intended target of a would-be carjacker pulls out a gun, it doesn't make any difference to the carjacker whether that person has a badge or whether there's a law against taking people's cars. Without a ruling class, decent people would still have every incentive, ability and right to organize and cooperate to defend against thugs and thieves, and they wouldn't need any badge, official title, legislation, or special rights to do so. And as with any service, people can hire others to help with protection. Every person doesn't have to do it himself. Now, some people might assume that if people organize for mutual protection and defense, then that is a government, but that is not at all the case. Political authority is not about people coming together to do something that everyone already has the right to do. Political authority is about one group of people claiming the right to do things which normal people do not have the right to do, such as taxing and controlling everyone else. Organized defense can be very effective without anyone claiming any special right to rule. In other words, without having any special authority and without being government. Even when there is government, there are still freelance thieves and thugs who are not deterred by the laws of the politicians anyway. But the ultimate irony is that while so many people hope that government will protect them from common criminals, government itself always ends up being the biggest thug and thief around. To be blunt, creating a huge gang, one far too big and powerful for the average person to resist, and giving that gang societal permission to control and extort everyone else by way of law and taxes, in the hope that that gang will prevent theft and thuggery, is an absurd idea. Another common objection to the idea of a stateless society, a world without government, is the notion that if not for a group of lawmakers telling the rest of us how to behave, we would all behave like stupid, irresponsible, violent animals. This claim implies one of two things. Either we normal people have no idea what is right and wrong unless and until politicians tell us, or the only reason we want to do the right thing and coexist peacefully is because politicians command us to. A quick examination of your own motivations and behaviors proves that neither of those things is actually true. To argue that only government can make people behave in a civilized manner is particularly odd in a society where politicians are voted into power. If the people themselves have no moral code and no conscience and are just stupid, violent animals, why does almost everyone want government to keep the peace and protect the innocent? Would a population of vicious, heartless, evil people try to elect good people to keep the evil people in line? Obviously not. Human goodness and the desire for order and peace already come from the people, not from the lawmakers they vote into office. The same holds true for everything government does. If people are so short-sighted and selfish that they can't be trusted to voluntarily organize and fund whatever they deem important, then how can those same people be trusted to decide who should be in power? The implication is that the average person can't be trusted to run his own life, but can be trusted to choose someone to run everyone else's life. To argue that government is necessary for keeping society peaceful and civilized is to claim that normal people can't wait to commit evil, but also can't wait to vote for politicians who will forcibly stop them from committing evil. Contrary to what most of us were taught, government and politics are not a civilizing influence at all. Indeed, political authority is the arch enemy of peaceful coexistence. People who would never personally rob their neighbors themselves constantly vote for the government to do it for them. People who would never dream of trying to control every detail of their neighbors' lives think it's just fine to ask politicians to do exactly that. The game of politics constantly encourages people to use the violence of the state to rob and control other people without any risk or feeling of guilt for the one who votes for that to happen. Government, rather than serving as a check against the imperfections of our nature, instead drastically amplifies our greed, resentment, irresponsibility, and malice by giving us a legal, risk-free way to forcibly interfere with the lives and choices of our fellow man. In short, politics brings out the bully and meddling busybody in everyone. In contrast, without a ruling class, people wouldn't be forever asking lawmakers to interfere with their neighbors' lives, and thugs and thieves wouldn't be able to deny responsibility for their evil deeds by by saying they were just following orders. Throughout history, far more theft, assault, oppression, even murder has been committed by those acting on behalf of authority than by anyone else. Even basically good people, when they believe in government, condone things which they know would be wrong if they did them on their own. Most people know that theft and assault are bad, but they imagine that controlling their neighbors and forcing them to pay for things they don't want is perfectly fine when done by way of the political process. Wrong becomes right when it's called taxation, legislation, regulation, and war. Anarchists know better. They know that human society will never be perfect, but that it would be a whole lot better if evil deeds were committed only by genuinely nasty, sociopathic people, rather than being advocated and committed by many millions of basically good people who have been taught to believe that aggression is morally acceptable when it's called taxation, law enforcement, and national defense. Using yourself as an example, how many things have you voted to have government do to your neighbors that you know you would have no moral right to do to them yourself? The fundamental principle of voluntarism, a more specific term for anarchism, is very simple. It's wrong to initiate force against any other person, regardless of badges, laws, or alleged authority. The only time the use of force is justified is to defend against aggression. The vast majority of people already understand this on a personal level, but they've been taught that this basic rule of social living does not apply when it comes to the game of politics and government. Without shame or guilt, everyone who votes asks the ruling class to do things to his neighbors which he knows would be wrong if he did them himself. Most people know how to get along and want a peaceful and just society. Giving up the belief in government doesn't suddenly turn someone into a violent animal, because our morality doesn't come from legislation and our ability to organize and cooperate doesn't come from any ruling class. Our ability, right, and desire to be productive, to help each other, to protect the innocent, and to stop the wicked does not come from government. In fact, it is threatened by government more than by anything else. Indeed, most injustice, oppression, and strife, most of man's inhumanity to man, is a direct result of authoritarian political power. Contrary to what politicians pretend, ruling classes do not produce peaceful coexistence. Instead, they intentionally cause perpetual conflict and violence, exploiting our compassion, virtue, and good intentions, turning them into wealth and power for the worst people in the world, while crushing the freedom and prosperity of everyone else. Of course, the people who benefit most from the political racket will do their best to convince you that it's a social necessity. But ask yourself this: have the thousands of laws, regulations, and taxes imposed upon you made you a better, more productive, and more caring person? Is the world better off with the politicians taking your money and telling you how to live your life? Or would things be better if you were allowed to spend your own money and make your own decisions? Is society really best served by a small class of people forcibly imposing a centralized master plan on everyone else? Can the orders and threats of a ruling class make the world what it should be? Or would society be better served by freedom, a respect for individual rights, voluntary cooperation, and peaceful organization? If this second option sounds better to you, maybe you should learn more about anarchism and voluntarism. People are not perfect, and some are downright malicious and dangerous. And some people mistakenly view anarchism as a utopian idea that would only work if everyone were generous and compassionate. But if people are too stupid, greedy, and malicious to be free, aren't they also too stupid, greedy, and malicious to be trusted with power? If you don't trust some stranger to have control over his own life, why would you trust him to have control over yours? Whether people are inherently good, inherently bad, or some of each, giving a small group of people power and control over everyone else is never the answer. Many still insist we need government because people can't be trusted. as if government is anything other than people, some of the worst people around in fact. And many still believe that obedience to authority is what makes us civilized, when in reality it does the opposite. Far more evil has been committed in the name of law and authority than has been committed in spite of it. The ultimate irony is that most people are still desperately hoping to achieve a fair, just, free and prosperous society by way of the very institution that has been responsible for more theft, thuggery, extortion, terrorism, torture and murder than all others combined: government. Everyone knows that governments can be corrupt, abusive, inefficient, counterproductive, even tyrannical, but most people still assume that if only the right people were in charge, that would fix the problem. But over and over again, regardless of who was in power and regardless of the particular arrangement or structure of the political power, a democracy, a republic, a dictatorship, a collective, etc., history has demonstrated that power corrupts and that freedom is far more conducive to peace and prosperity than any political solution ever has been, ever could be, or ever will be. People have spent centuries trying to create a good society using different kinds of ruling classes, different kinds of legal structures, different ways of choosing rulers and so on. But without exception, every authoritarian governmental construction has resulted in freedom and riches for a small few and oppression, violence and poverty for others. What if, instead of deciding what the throne should look like and who should sit on it, all people of goodwill embraced the non-aggression principle? What if, instead of looking to a ruling class to forcibly impose our values onto society, we embraced the concept of self-ownership? In a nutshell, anarchists want you to have complete control over your choices, your money, and your life. As long as you are not using force or fraud to inflict harm onto others, they want you to have absolute freedom. All they ask is that you treat them the same way. You own yourself, your neighbor owns himself. Committing aggression is wrong. These principles are simple and obvious to the point of being self-evident, and yet they are diametrically opposed to the authoritarian principles that most of us have been taught. At the end of the day, you need to choose which you want: peaceful coexistence amongst equals, anarchism, or authoritarian domination with some ruling over everyone else, government. The two are mutually exclusive. Despite what would-be rulers want you to believe, anarchism does not mean chaos and violence, or every man for himself. And having no government doesn't mean having no morality, no organization, and no cooperation. Simply put, anarchism means that no one is your master, and that no one is your slave. And that's all it means. For a more thorough understanding of why a stateless society based upon voluntary cooperation and organization, rather than based upon government force and authoritarian control, is the only moral or rational choice, read The Most Dangerous Superstition by Locke and Rose.
What makes you think that the non-aggression principle would play out in practice? It's something that every person in that society would have to be educated on and abide by. I know you don't advocate for no system of government and no laws, but the mere idea of a non-aggression principle, it just seems outlandish, at least as an expectation for how people should act.
Claiming just that it is outlandish is a logical fallacy, known as the argument from incredulity. However, the non-aggression principle isn't necessarily something that an anarcho-capitalist would argue should be the principle to follow. The argument is usually that it is a principle we all follow every day. Every conversation we have that doesn't result in violence, every transaction we make, not including VAT of course, and every job we do. It is also expected that people will indeed violate it, and that's specifically why it allows for self-defense, be it directly or through a third party. The argument is in fact that we should apply the principles we hold in daily life to the state, that is the greatest violator of them. And also, yes, I do advocate for no government and in turn no laws, or at least government and laws in the manner that they are currently understood and in the way that you are asking.
How would a country defend its borders in an ANCAP system? Do you even believe in the idea of a country?
A country is a geographical place? Yes, sure. Just in the same way that a city is a geographical place. In a free society, however, all property would be privately owned, and have their own private borders that the individuals owning that land would be responsible for. If they want their private borders to be open, that would be up to them, and if they want to close them, that is also up to them.
Do you expect to maintain a nation-state without any kind of a government to defend the borders of said nation-state? Do you plan on everybody, just as soon as there's trouble, taking up arms? What about the people who don't want to fight? Would you force them to defend the homeland?
Now, most of this question is somewhat irrelevant. If there is a nation-state, there is not a free society. If there are public borders, there is not a free society. If someone attempts to violate your property, you can hire those that are willing to act in third-party self-defense to assist you. In the case of something larger scale, many people would likely do so, as it would be in their best interests, be it for financial reasons or in defense of their property as well.
You guys claim that everything that the state does end up in violence. Has there not been a point where the state does not do something that end up in violence?
The double negative in your question threw me for a bit. Now, the state is funded through the threat of violence, meaning that everything it does is linked to violence. But in terms of individual actions separate from the funding, I'm sure there are occasions, just not many that I can think of off the top of my head.
Why do you guys hate taxes so much?
For the same reason people hate perpetrators of armed violence.
How do you rationalize the idea that taxation is theft? I know you'll always default to the argument that, well, if you don't pay it, there are people coming to your door with guns to take you away or to take the money by force, but you're forgetting that you participate in a society. And I don't want to be the guy who says that this is some sort of necessary cost of living in a society because of the benefits that it provides. But have you ever thought about it that way?
Sure, perhaps it is a necessary cost of society. I don't think it is. But even if that were the case, it does not change the nature of it. It would only be a justification of it. It is theft because it is taking property without the consent of the person who has rightful ownership of it. It being a necessary cost, as you put it, doesn't suddenly make it a voluntary transaction.
If Somalia is not the best example of an anarchist society, then what is?
Somalia isn't that much of an example, considering that it has an operating government. Throughout the 90s, however, when central government was, for all intents and purposes, absent, the economy and quality in Somalia improved quite rapidly when you compare it to its neighbours. Despite this, however, regional warlords and the US that was funding them meant this was not a free society by any means.
How do you expect to keep your citizenry safe from rogue companies, essentially, who want to cut corners at the cost of the consumer and workers' safety?
Employees moving to one of their many competitors, customers that are unhappy, either boycotting or going elsewhere, perhaps even a security firm to protect you should they go rogue. The question is, why would they do so when every market incentive points towards keeping your customers happy, especially in a competitive market?
Would an ANCAP system allow me to sell a 9-year-old heroin-addicted child prostitute into slavery?
No, they have self-ownership. If you tried to, people would be outraged and used third-party self-defense to stop you, either themselves or through a security firm.
How does the free market do everything better than the government?
By incentivizing the improvement of quality, the lowering of costs, and maintaining a good public image, so that you can compete in that market, unlike the monopoly of the state that has none of those incentives. To turn that question around, how could the government ever do anything better than the free market?
How do you plan on maintaining things like hospitals, police stations, and roads without any source of regulation to keep them in order?
The same way we do everything else. Individuals, companies, and charities that operate to fulfill a demand that is there in the market. Or are you going to tell me that there is no demand for hospitals or roads suddenly?
What would happen to people who simply cannot work?
I'm assuming you're asking how they would survive. The answer to that is that they could rely upon the support of family, friends, charities, and even companies that need a good PR boost. Of course, without a minimum wage to price millions out of the market and a welfare state incentivizing them to stay out of it, there would likely be a lot less people who couldn't or wouldn't work.
Okay, serious question this time. How would an ANCAP system deal with water reclamation and sewage and stuff like that?
Do you mean to say that none of your previous questions were serious? Regardless, I have already answered this. The fact that you are asking the question implies that there is a demand for these things. You would hire a company to fit piping to your property, if for some reason it was not already there. There is a demand for those services, and therefore an incentive for people to provide them. A government military is no guarantee of successfully defending an invasion by another. Almost every invasion in history is one state invading another, obviously because most places in that history have had a government. But the point to that is that any government, if they have more advanced technology, if they have more abundant resources, if they have a vastly larger population, or even just being more strategically located, they will have a significant advantage over their opposition, and no differences in the way society functions there at the time is going to save them from being taken over. As well as this, nobody can really say for sure what type of defence a stateless society would have at any given time. By not having a central state, the market, when left to decide, would more than likely provide the most cost-effective and reliable solutions to maintain competitiveness within that market, whatever those changing solutions may be. And why would you even want to attack it anyway? An untaxed and unregulated market, free to innovate faster and cheaper costs, would surely be a prime target for trading, not invasion. Especially when trading for the things that you need is likely going to be much cheaper than the cost of war, and certainly much better for maintaining public support. Consider also that if you did invade a stateless society, there is no infrastructure to take over, no tax system, no specific national military, no centrally managed police system. Everything would have to be built from scratch before you can even begin to recover the losses of invasion. A society that lacks the governments of others would also be, by default, neutral, a position that has most notably served the Swiss for over 200 years so far without incident. By staying out of the politics of countries, and certainly not intervening in the way nations such as the UK and the US have done, it would be hard for anyone to portray a stateless society as a direct threat. But for the sake of argument, let us say that you do find some reason to invade, whatever it may be. There is a market demand for security. If there were not, the question of it wouldn't be raised, governments wouldn't do it, and I certainly wouldn't be talking about it right now. There are a few more obvious ways in which the market could meet this demand, most prominently through competing private security firms giving individuals the opportunity to either subscribe or pay as and when for protection of their property, and perhaps there would even be charity-based options too. How well armed and how numerous these firms are would most likely be a mystery to any invader. After all, why reveal that information if you're trying to compete in a market when it will be evidently detrimental? Defeat also of one of these firms would not mean defeat of the others. All the hypothetical eggs are not in the same basket. As to what kind of security will be provided by these firms, a few of them developing nuclear deterrence may be more cost-effective than maintaining a standing army, and it could be argued the most reliable defence currently. Very few would ignore the threat of mutually assured destruction. There's also the issue of the gun behind every blade of grass. Lacking in the restrictions on property ownership that governments implement, it would be easy to assume that there would be many weapons in the hands of individuals, and certainly more advanced ones than most governments allow today. This alone would ensure massive casualties for any invader, even if eventually successful. And if we were to assume that the stateless society started on a level footing with its surrounding governments, without the market restrictions that those governments put in place, new technology and innovation to maintain competitiveness would move along much quicker, and without the taxes on the sales of such things, comparatively cheaper too. A stateless society would likely outdevelop any potential invaders, given adequate time to do so. It would be in the interests of people to protect their freedom from imposition by a state. It would be in the interests of business owners to protect the market that allows them success. And it would definitely be in the interests of the security firms, whose industry would be entirely destroyed by any successful invader. There would be no lack of people ready to fight. So when faced with an unknown number of enemies, armed with an unknown level of technology and amount of it, including potentially nuclear arms and a population that, if like any other, would be ready to defend their freedom, why on earth would you consider it a prime target for invasion? And no, I have no doubt that a stateless society would be invadable. especially if it were a stateless society in the third world being targeted by, say, a modern Western government. But beyond initial disparities, I do not see any reason to believe that it will be any more of a target than a state with a government, and perhaps even less of one.
What would people do without the government telling them what to do when there's a virus out? And it is a good question, because people would do what they've always done, probably, which is if you feel vulnerable, if you have diseases and problems, then you'd probably stay home. You'd probably stay out of the public. You'd probably have someone go shopping for you, maybe, or a family member would do that, as they always have. Instead, for the first time in history, they've locked up people who are not sick and kept people who are not sick from visiting with other people who are not sick. So this goes against what human nature does.
You know, this is the same argument as what was going around during slave owning times. Hey, yeah, slavery is immoral, but this is the real world. A whole industry, agricultural industry, depends on it. Who's going to pick the cotton? I'm a pragmatist. I'm a realist. And this is why I fucking flipped out, and I get so mad, because I've spent months talking to some of these people, like, trying to explain, but some people just don't want to even begin to understand. They've already made up their mind. And you can't teach a pig to sing. Sometimes you gotta snap and answer the pig in their same language. But the point is, you know, you can argue the details about roads and social services and all this, but if someone doesn't understand the root of why we support voluntarism, anarchism, which is a moral reason, which is a philosophical reason, then no amount of talking about practical solutions and how things will actually be worked out in logistics is going to fucking matter. Because the moral, philosophical thing always comes first. Who's the government governing the government? Some people say, well, it's international governance organizations. It's the EU. It's the UN. Well, then who governs them to make sure that they're not doing bad, dastardly things? Well, it's a system of checks and balances. Well, that's circular reasoning, because if you say they need to be governed because people are just undependable and evil and they just want to go rape and pillage each other and we got to have a government, those are the same people that you're saying would do that. So why would you give them all the power? Why would you centralize? If people are that fucking evil, that's all they want to do is go rape and pillage and murder and kill and destroy. Why the fuck would you centralize that power and give them even more power? It's a cult. There's no government. They function in anarchy. And you know why? Because that anarchy gives them the freedom. Everything is anarchy. Existence just is. Because of that isness, they can do what they want. And they agree with each other. They don't even need a government, and their plans work out splendidly because of their anarchic agreements with each other behind closed doors. Within this pure freedom anarchy, they've built this construct called government, which is a religion and a cult, which keeps most people duped and locked in its confines, so they can't see that the very people that are selling it, the legitimacy of the concept of government, don't even fucking believe in government. They just believe in power. So it's all anarchy. They're using anarchy for evil. We can use it for good. But what most of you are doing is serving the liars that are so obviously lying to you, telling you they care about your well-being. And you're helping that power for evil because you want to fight the idea of anarchy. Sorry, but anarchy is all there is. Accept it. Take responsibility. Finally take responsibility for yourself. They don't care about you, and they're fucking leading the planet full of people off a cliff of destruction. That's chaos. That's anarchy. Anarchy also allows for good agreements, order, consensual rules between people. God forbid, but I use the word, but consensual governance with private property owners. Hey, Joe. Hey, Bob. We both own this land here. If we build a park here, We can make our own policies for it. Sure, because we own our bodies acquired this unowned land for us, and now the park is ours. That makes sense. Some dipshit coming over from Europe saying, all this shit is mine because I landed on the fucking rock. That's bullshit. Obviously. You're brainwashed.
Without government, there would be chaos.
Breaching social distancing.
Quick question. The government is made up of people, right?
Of course it is.
And those people are just like you and me, right?
Yes, except they're the government.
We need government to govern people. Who governs the government?
Are you stupid? There's international governments.
And they're people like you and me too, right?
Yes, but they are specially chosen.
Okay, so who governs the very top international government people? Because what it sounds like to me is that they're existing in a state of anarchy, and they're using that anarchy for chaos, where things like farmers markets, small communities, families, churches, peaceful individuals use the natural state of anarchy, which is no ruler, which is reality, for good things. So why do we need a government?
Here's a demand curve for roads. You see that as prices rise, more people are willing to provide roads, and as prices fall, more people are willing to buy access to roads or to buy roads. These two drives cross, and where they cross becomes the market price or the going rate. Now what happens when you give someone a monopoly on roads? Well, because there is no longer competition, the demand has no power. Let's say the most profitable price for road access is 7 cents a mile to the supplier. Less people will use the road as a result, but the higher price makes up for it. If you raise it any higher than 7 cents a mile, you will lose too many customers and actually start losing money in total. So in a monopoly, you are actually producing less road at a higher price than in a competitive market. So when you give the government an effective monopoly on roads through extreme subsidies, you can expect them to be too expensive and there to be not enough of them. Other problems with public roads? Because they are a common access resource, they will be overused. You pay taxes no matter what, and you don't pay less taxes when you don't use it, so roads function as a common access resource. They are free to use. It's also a political resource, and so road allocation will be skewed to districts with influential politicians. This is why you will have bridges to nowhere. Public roads are also not optional. You cannot opt out of the public road system. And as in all democratic systems, you are at the mercy of the majority. People can vote to make you pay for their roads. And of course, this is exactly what happens. On the other hand, private roads will be cheaper and of a higher quality as a result of competition. They will be more environmentally friendly. There's a built-in incentive to carpool. Also, the users will pay. Thus, the cost will be specific to personal use and area use. People who don't use roads won't pay for them, and the roads will be built where they are needed. And finally, perhaps roads aren't the most efficient way for people to travel. Roads are so heavily subsidized that there's no way to tell at this point. People often assume roads are the most efficient, but roads just get so much seized from everyone else that it's really difficult to compete. The privatizing of roads could result in a rebirth of rail. Maybe we'll be more like Europe and Japan in that regard, although European rail companies receive heavy subsidies. And finally, please don't believe that there won't be transportation if there is no state. If you believe that transportation cannot make a sustainable return on investment in a free market, then you are basically saying that transportation is not worth the cost, in which there shouldn't be state funding anyway. But the truth is that transportation is worth the cost, and so people will pay to have it done by private companies, and the private companies will provide it more cheaply, more fairly, and with higher quality. If you are worried that the underclass won't have access to transportation, what you need to keep in mind is that employers pay for transportation anyway. And if roads were privatized, then employers would pay less taxes and would have more money to pay for wages. And the underclass would have more wages to pay for their private transportation. And in all likelihood, the underclass would be better off as a result because the roads are now cheaper.
but that's because I know that freedom isn't free. So there's a lot of control that comes when you're living off of the government. So I have never, and we have no example in the history of time of living for free, being given everything by government and having a free society. Government doesn't create anything, Charles. They are the creator of nothing. They are only a transferer. So there still has to be people out there making money and having wealth to transfer to people that aren't going to be doing anything. And you really have to realize that and realize this isn't going to last. I can't do nothing forever.
And what innovations we've missed out on since competition in the medical world was hobbled. One thing does seem clear. We have a crisis in healthcare costs today because government solved the last one.
Police break their own protocol every day, every hour, every second, around the globe. Lawmakers make secret backroom deals and break their own laws. There's one set of rules for them. They are the holy class. And another set of rules for you and I.
You know, people talking about other cases, medieval Ireland, the American Western frontier, in many respects, was stateless and had a competitive legal system. Other examples people want to talk about?
There was an article, The Not So Wild Wild West, in the Journal of Libertarian Studies, of which Roderick was the editor, and it gave that as an example. Joe Peden does stuff on ancient Ireland. David Friedman did stuff on ancient Iceland. I would quarrel with the question. The import of the question is, you say you're in favor of full free enterprise and laissez-faire anarchism. Has there ever been an example of it? No, well then your claim is invalid. We also claim that we want a society with no murder and no rape. Has there ever been such a society with no murder and no rape? No. Therefore, we have to retract our desire to have a society with no murder and no rape? No. So just because there's never been a perfect example and we're on the wrong side of the Garden of Eden for perfection, just because there's never been an example doesn't undermine the claim that it's a good thing. There are many other examples. The law of the sea merchant, when in the 15th or the 17th century, when somebody from Belgium was trading with somebody from England and they had a dispute, they had admiralty courts and the law merchant. The institution of kosher foods is a anarcho-capitalist kind of a thing because they certify foods without any government approval and people are free to accept it or not. We live not in a pure anarcho-libertarian state, of course, but there are vestiges of it. Whenever two people trade anything, whenever you go to the store and buy a newspaper for $1, that's part of anarcho-capitalism.
Sometimes you can see kind of seeds of that in completely unexpected places. I went to the Republic of South Africa recently, which is almost a socialist state. But because of the failure of the state, there is private protection agencies. To the point even that I took a picture of the headquarters of Cape Town Police Department. It's a huge building, high-rise, Cape Town Police Department. There was a little plaque there. It said, protected by ADT, we shoot without warning.
You go to Disney World and it's very safe. There's no murders and no rapes there, and they got ducks and geese and mice, and if you act obstreperously, you're surrounded by them, and they're all packing heat, and they say, come with me. They've got cameras there. You're very safe there. You go to Audubon Park in New Orleans or Central Park in New York City or any of the big parks, and it's like anarchy. I mean, wait, no, chaos. Because when people get murdered there, nobody loses money. There's no weeding out of inefficient management of public spaces. Whereas in private spaces, it's pretty safe. This place here, this club is a pretty safe place because if it weren't, they would lose money and we would have, they would go broke or they would tend to go broke. If something happens in the streets of Chicago, the mayor of Chicago doesn't lose money, nor does the police department. So we have little vestiges of it all over if you look carefully for it.
Just one quick last note. People often point to Somalia as an example of the horrors of anarchy. But the question is, what's the relevant comparison? And there's been interesting some research done. There's an article by Ben Powell and some other people. I forget who the co-authors are, but you can find that online. Somalia after state collapse. And the point is that if you compare Somalia both with if you compare stateless Somalia with its earlier state-ridden self, and also if you compare it with its neighbors of comparable economic and cultural and political development and so forth, it's safer and more orderly than those places. So what that suggests is that the market always does the best it can with the materials that it's got. So if you've got a very poor country with a horrible history of and stuff, then it can't do as well with it as it could do with another country, but it does better. Any country will do better without a state than it would do under a state.
Well, sure, you can say that slavery is bad and all, and that people shouldn't be forcibly robbed of the fruits of their labors, and I don't necessarily disagree, but I mean, we can't just do away with it with nothing to replace it. We have to gradually transition from slavery to no slavery. And I wouldn't even go for that unless and until you can describe for me just how every aspect of society will work without slavery. You can't just say it's wrong and suddenly end it. I mean, who will pick the cotton? You have to ease into these things. Maybe we can start by petitioning slave owners to allow their slaves to have more free time, and maybe ask them to not whip the slave so hard or so often. But we can't be extreme. We can't just say it's bad, so end it right now. Think of the chaos that would ensue if tomorrow there was suddenly no slavery. Just because some slave masters are really nasty, yeah, I guess it's pretty much all of them, but that still doesn't mean that slavery in and of itself is inherently bad. Yeah, we definitely need rules limiting how nasty the slave owners can be to their slaves, but that doesn't mean that the institution has to be done away with entirely. I mean, no slavery? Come on, that's kooky and extreme. It's utopian. I mean, just think of slavery as a necessary evil. Well, sure, you can say that
government
is bad and all, and that people shouldn't be forcibly robbed of the fruits of their labors, and I don't necessarily disagree, but I mean, we can't just do away with it with nothing to replace it. We have to gradually transition from
government to no government.
And I wouldn't even go for that unless and until you can describe for me just how every aspect of society will work without
government.
You can't just say it's wrong and suddenly end it. I mean, who will
build the roads?
You have to ease into these things. Maybe we can start by petitioning
Congress to reduce or eliminate certain taxes and to repeal unjust laws.
But we can't be extreme. We can't just say it's bad, so end it right now. Think of the chaos that would ensue if tomorrow there was suddenly no
government.
Just because some
governments
are really nasty, yeah, I guess it's pretty much all of them, but that still doesn't mean that
government
in and of itself is inherently bad. Yeah, we definitely need rules limiting how nasty the
governments
can be
to the people.
But that doesn't mean that the institution has to be done away with entirely. I mean, no
government.
Come on, that's kooky and extreme. It's utopian. I mean, just think of
government
as a necessary evil.
There's all sorts of regulations that have been created by state and local governments to try to protect their police departments from competition by and large. And those things have to be broken down. My name's Bruce Benson. I'm an economist at Florida State University. I'm chair of the economics department. Essentially what it does is suggest that there's massive government failure in the area of law, creation of law, enforcement of law, dispute resolution, all those sorts of things, and that there are private alternatives that work much better, and in fact would create a more just society, I think, while becoming more efficient at the same time. The punishment for abuses by public police are trivial compared to the damages they can do to people. You can't sue the public police for making a mistake like you could a private firm. Private individuals would be liable for the consequences of their actions. Competition would be intense, but it's not going to be violent competition because that's expensive. If we were to move to privatization, I will predict that there will be lots of new innovations that I never dreamed of, despite the fact that I've been studying these issues for a couple of decades now. In the United States, historically, for instance, people moved westward much faster than the government did. And as they moved westward, they created their own communities voluntarily, recognized each other's property, formed associations for protection, and developed their own dispute resolution mechanisms from the bottom up. Even today, with public policing and public law enforcement, we see a market for private security, private investigative services and things like that. Imagine an insurance company, for instance, selling insurance against robbery and so on. Of course, they have to pay off then, but if they have the right then to pursue the criminal and collect damages from the criminal, they would invest in much more investigative services. We all read the paper and see about police shooting somebody who's innocent. Don't wait till it happens to you. So there's not a trade-off between liberty and security. You can have both, but you aren't going to get it through the government.
Imagine you have a friend called George. You've been friends since childhood. Although you're not as close as you were back then, you still see each other once in a while and get along very well. One day, you and George are approached by an old mutual friend, Oliver. Oliver explains that he's had a run of bad luck and is raising money to cover tuition fees for his kids. You want to help Oliver out, so you give him some money. To your surprise, George doesn't offer Oliver any help. You try to persuade him, but it's no use. Imagining yourself in this situation, do you think it's okay to threaten to use physical force against George to get him to do the right thing? Now imagine a slightly different situation. This time, a group of your friends take a vote. 6 out of 10 are in favour of threatening George to get him to help Oliver. Does this democratic process make it okay to threaten George? One last change to the situation. This time, imagine that many thousands of people have democratically agreed that a group, who we'll call the agents, should do whatever is necessary to take money from George and give it to Oliver's family. The agents don't explicitly threaten George at first. All they do is send him a bill. Like everyone else, though, George knows what will happen if he doesn't pay the bill. First, he'll get more letters demanding payment, and the bill will get bigger. Eventually, if he still doesn't pay, agents with guns will break into his house and take him away against his will. Almost everyone pays the bills without protest. They know that agents are prepared to use as much force as necessary to overpower you if you resist. Do you think it's acceptable for the agents to threaten violence against George if he doesn't give his money towards helping Oliver's family? If we approve of state programs that redistribute wealth, we must also approve of threats of violence made against peaceful individuals, because this is how the funds are collected. On the other hand, most of us feel uncomfortable about threatening peaceful people when we imagine having to make the threats ourselves. If we feel negatively towards the idea of threatening George personally, can we really be comfortable with the threats made against him by agents of the state? Some people believe that voluntary interaction and spontaneous order are realistic and preferable alternatives to state coercion as a way of organising society. Do a web search for some of these terms if you're interested in learning more. Do a web search for some of these terms if you're interested in learning more.
Does the government work for us, or do we work for the government? Should America send its military abroad looking for monsters to slay and imposing democracy on people unprepared for it? Or should we let other countries decide for themselves what their governments will look like? Tonight, war, peace, and the struggle for freedom. Thomas Hobbes once said that the natural state of man was perpetual war. It's not hard to see why he would come to this conclusion, since the story of mankind is filled with evidence of organized violence and gross wickedness. But the premise that because human life in its original state was nasty, brutish, and short, the imposition of government was necessary to liberate people and to assure human progress is flawed. It doesn't make sense that a society could be organized simply because the strongest combatant in a war had accrued firepower necessary to exercise and enforce a self-proclaimed exclusive use of violence over a portion of that territory. That, of course, is the definition of government, the entity that monopolizes force. Society can and certainly has self-organized over the course of history, though the natural state of man is complete freedom, and though government is essentially the negation of freedom. Man is rational and social, and society emerged through the cooperation of free people, not through force. The idea that governments must exist to create the space for a vibrant society is ridiculous. Government has no resources of its own, only what it steals, and it can't build any institutions until there is a society over which to build them. Government makes laws and then monopolizes force so as to compel compliance with those laws. But is all this force always necessary? Free communities can negotiate rules on their own that operate under natural rights and the free market. During the gold rush in California in the 1850s, for example, where there was no formal government, communities of miners often created rules and regulations on their own, ones that worked so well that they spread all the way to the Great Plains. The federal government largely adopted them when it came in to claim the western frontier, when it was profitable to do so, but not before Congress tried to seize the land from the prospectors who opened it up in the first place. Because it is basically a parasite, government never enters an enterprise unless there is something valuable to appropriate from it. Government cannot even exist until society exists, and society can't exist until free people cooperate and come together freely. How do we achieve peace in such a world? Donald Rumsfeld was correct when he told me that there'll be no peace in the world until every man is free, because to every man he is the world. But where Secretary Rumsfeld and his fellow neoconservatives are wrong is in their assertions that the military can free other men and that our government can free other people, even people it doesn't claim to represent. Precisely because every man is his own world. The only barrel of a gun that can free a man is his own barrel of his own gun. Each one of us across the world owns our own struggle for freedom because each one of us has our own ideas of what freedom means to us. Our natural rights are obviously universal, meaning that God created all of us with the same rights, no matter where our mothers were when we entered the world. And God instilled in all of us a continuous yearning to be free. We have enshrined many of these rights in our Constitution, and that has allowed people in this country to pursue happiness and build prosperity, never before seen anywhere on the planet. And that happened here because people here were free to be free. even if limits on that freedom and expansive, unprecedented freedom were applied by the government. What freedom means is unique to each of us because we each exercise our natural rights in our own way. And that is the meaning of freedom. It cannot be imposed by force. It cannot be created by the government. It cannot be granted by the government. Friedrich von Hayek once said that freedom granted only when it is known beforehand that its effects will be beneficial is not freedom at all. So here is the lesson. True peace and order emerge from the interaction of free people in an environment where natural rights are honored and respected. A peace that is imposed through force is not a peace at all, and an order that is imposed through force is not conducive to stability, because a coerced people yearn for more freedom. The world is full of change, and so are we. Stability comes from freedom because a free people will be able to interact and engage with each other and live in a way that is mutually respectful of natural rights. The quest for peace must reject the initiation of force, and the struggle for freedom must reject subjugation. As we continue to follow the uprisings in the Mideast and around the world, we can be hopeful that unlike the failed experiments in Iraq and Afghanistan, unlike the enormous loss of life, liberty, and property of Americans and others that Secretary Rumsfeld brought about, these struggles may secure the blessings of freedom for a people who are ready to seize those blessings for themselves. But it will not be an easy task.
Hey, Larkin Rose here. What would it be like to live in a lawless society? This is a thing that comes up a lot. People saying, well, I can't picture what it would be like to live with no law. Wouldn't it be chaos and mayhem and death and destruction? So let's look at the notion of what it means to not have law. In the political sense, law is threats made up by the ruling class. Whether it's you're not allowed to commit murder or you're not allowed to grow lettuce and sell it to people unless you comply with these 1,000 pages of regulation. Those are both law. But when people talk about like there's no law, they're often very vague in their own head what they're even talking about, because they're so used to a society in which there's a ruling class and it gives all these rules and commands and it hurts people who disobey. And most people don't really know how to picture a world without that, and so they think that, well, if this is the source of order and civilization, like law in a legal system, then without it, it would be chaos and bloody mayhem and this and that and the other thing. So I want to describe what lawlessness would actually mean, what it would literally mean, and what it would look like. Again, a law is a command issued by politicians. Now, a lot of people assume, even though it's sort of ridiculous, they assume that, well, if there was no law, people could do whatever they wanted and there would be no consequences. The people who say this or assume it or think that just haven't thought about it enough. Because to say that is to say that if somebody attacked you, you would just let them. You wouldn't do anything to them if there wasn't a politician scribble in a law book somewhere saying they're not allowed to do that. Really? You wouldn't defend yourself? You wouldn't defend somebody else? You don't think anybody else would defend themselves? The law is scribbles on paper, and that's all. Now, there are thugs with guns who enforce the law, and a lot of people assume that, well, they're the ones who protect us, which most of the time, no, they're not. But okay, you were taught that and you repeat that and you believe that, and then it's easy to jump to the bogus conclusion that, well, without them, without law enforcers and without politicians, enacting these acts of legislation, everybody could just do whatever they want. But it's ridiculous, because to say that there would be no consequences is to demonstrate that you have no idea how human nature works and how cause and effect work. Like in a society, I like to use the example of, okay, let's say you and 100 people you don't know, you got shipwrecked or your plane crashed and now you're on a big desert island and it's just you. Do you think everybody would just immediately resort to attacking and killing and eating each other? No, obviously not. Most people don't want that. They want to cooperate. They want to organize. They want to figure out how to do things. And if somebody decided to run around attacking people, the idea that there would be no consequences to his actions are ridiculous. If he attacked me, there would be consequences. In fact, if he attacked somebody else in front of me, there would be consequences to his actions. Law is not the source of the consequence. People deciding to do something about it. Now, whether it's people deciding because they get paid to carry a gun and enforce the whims of politicians, or because people don't want to get attacked, either way, there's a consequence to attacking people. And so when people talk about lawlessness, they're not sure what they mean. And there's so much about, the mythology, the political mythology we were all taught, that people talk in terms that they've never thought about and don't really understand. The concept of law and crime and government and authority and a whole bunch of things that they've just never really focused on enough to be clear about it. For example, no law, a society with no law. I could say, in a society that didn't have a ruling class, hey, just so everybody knows, if somebody breaks into my house late at night, there's a good chance I'm going to shoot him. Like, if I think he's a threat to me or my family, I may just shoot him. If I have a chance to, like, if I can see who he is and see he's not a threat, I might not have to. But if you break into my house, you might get shot. That's just a description of reality. That's not a law. However, it's a pretty good deterrent to anybody planning on doing that if they realize, oh, he has a gun and he just told me he's going to shoot me. In fact, it doesn't even need to be a threat. Like, if I didn't say it out loud, that's just, well, that's what I would do. It still creates a deterrent. If people are thinking, if I'm attacking people all over the place and trying to steal their stuff, eventually one of them's not going to like it and is going to do something about it, and he might shoot me or beat me up or something or whatever. The consequence doesn't go away just because a scribble went away, a politician's scribble, legislation, law. Of course there would still be consequences. And there could even still be threats. Like I said, I can either just describe what I would do if somebody broke into my house, or I can put a thing out front that says, if you break into my house, I'm going to shoot you. And, there are shop owners in the LA riots and in other places that did this. Put a thing outside that if you loot my place, I'm just going to shoot you. Is that a law? Nope. Was that like a legislative decree? Nope. Did it require any special authority? Nope. Did it require a legislature? Nope. Was it moral? Well, you can decide that. I happen to think self-defense is legitimate. They weren't pretending to make up a new right just by writing those words on the front of their shop. They were telling people, don't break in here or we're going to freaking shoot you. That's not law. You don't need a law to deter people. And by the way, that deterred people way better than the entire LAPD and the entire law enforcement disaster during those riots, is people saying, if you break in here, I'm going to shoot you. That wasn't a law. Worked really well. Everywhere else was having riots, and I think it was Korean shops, a bunch of them did that, like got AR-15s and were up on the roofs with signs saying, if you try to loot us, we're just going to shoot you. Not surprisingly, the looters went to other places where they wouldn't be shot. So the deterrent doesn't require politician scribbles. The politicians aren't the one deterring anybody. Like, you can say that sometimes their armed thugs do, although mostly what they do is commit aggression instead of defend against it. But this notion of lawlessness and the idea that that means a free-for-all and no consequence and no deterrence to crime is silly, and it's a result of people just not really thinking things through about, okay, well, what would I do? Like, if there wasn't politicians, there wasn't 911, there weren't tax collectors and cops, would I just sit around and let myself be victimized? No. I might get a gun. I might get together with some of my neighbors and say, hey, if something goes wrong, do you want to call each other? Like, if there's somebody dangerous out there and shows up, like, I'll call you, come running if somebody's, attacking me or my property, and you call me if somebody's attacking your property, and we'll help each other out. Of course those things happen naturally, and they're not law, and they don't require authority. But if people are so, again, if they're so indoctrinated into the mindset of little children, which is what statism is. It's teaching people, including grown-ups, it's not up to you to fix anything or defend yourself or care for the poor or do anything. You just do as you're told and do your thing on your hamster wheel over and over again. And if anything out of the ordinary happens, call the authorities and let them handle it. That whole mindset is training people to be stupid children. And so a lot of people don't have any practice thinking as responsible adults. Like, all right, if there's somebody breaking into my neighbor's house, well, why isn't it my responsibility just as much as anybody else's? Like, I'm the one here. I can call the cops and wait for 15 minutes and hope they show up to draw a chalk outline around my dead neighbor. Or I can decide, well, I'm a grown-up, I have a gun, I better go try to save them or do something. And so when people are in the childish mindset of it doesn't even occur to them to try to do anything, they project that onto everybody else. And they decide nobody would do anything about thieves and crooks and murderers because they wouldn't. And the thing is, I don't even think that's true. Because if they realized, wow, nobody's coming to save me, they would do something. They would very quickly get into the mindset of, well, damn, I better figure out what to do. Instead of just sitting here, being a sitting duck, they would figure it out. And you can actually see this in a bunch of examples where some horrible thing is happening, some flood is happening, and people are suddenly like, authority ain't here to fix anything. We better start being like grown-ups and helping each other and cooperating and doing whatever we have to take care of each other and whatever else. People are totally capable of that, but they're trained not to think that way. And because of that training, they imagine lawlessness, as in there isn't a ruling class telling us what to do. They imagine that equals chaos, which is just a stupid thing to believe. But it's a little bit understandable the way they've been indoctrinated. But to think that without politician scribbles, the rest of us would just let nasty sociopaths walk all over us and victimize us without doing anything, that's just silly to the point of being ridiculous. The idea that lawlessness equals chaos is patently stupid, because it really does imply that if the politicians didn't say people aren't allowed to rob us and beat us up, then we would just let them. All of us, every single one of us. There would be no consequence to a thug or a thief or a murderer, because we'd all just say, well, darn, I wish there was a politician here to write something down on a piece of paper, because, gee, I don't know how on earth we'd ever defend ourselves, like individually or working together, without a politician writing something on a piece of paper. But that shows the immaturity of the statist mindset, and that is on purpose. That's programmed into people on purpose so that they view the world that way, so that they view the world as dangerous, scary chaos, unless we have a ruling class taking care of us and helping the poor and the old and protecting us from scary foreigners and terrorists and criminals and yada, 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 and everything else. And the truth of the matter is, lawlessness would be a huge step in the right direction. Even if it was overnight, even if it was among a population that isn't used to thinking in terms of being personally responsible, because they would get into that mindset really dang quickly out of necessity, because there wouldn't be an authority to come save the day or pretend it was going to save the day. Lawlessness doesn't mean, it's synonymous with chaos and everybody, death and destruction, blah, blah, blah. That's not at all what it would mean. What it would mean is none of those people would recognize anybody else as having the right to rule. And that's all. That's literally all it would mean. It doesn't mean they all suddenly forget that they have the right to defend themselves, or suddenly forget that they have the right to work together with other people and organize and cooperate and do all sorts of voluntary-based things that don't require slaves and don't require masters. Lawlessness would be a huge step in the right direction, but the connotation of the word, because of people's indoctrination, is so scary to people. And just for sort of a mental exercise, I would suggest that anybody scared of a lawless world, ask yourself, just, clearly think out, if there's a bunch of scenarios, well, I'm scared of this and this and this, first thing is, well, what would you do about it? What if there are roving, gangs of bandits? Well, what would you do? Would you stand out in the road with all your stuff and go, come take my stuff, durr? Would you maybe hide it? Would you run away? Would you get a gun? What would you do? And then what would the people in your family do? What would your neighbors do? What would neighbors farther out do? What would all the people you know do? And try to figure out what would actually happen instead of just jumping to this bizarre, silly assumption that if not for politicians bossing us around, we would just have no idea what to do about anything. That's just utterly ridiculous. But that's what the entire notion of lawlessness conveys. It conveys the idea that most people really think we're all wild, stupid animals unless politicians are telling us what to do. And that's ridiculous. Lawlessness would be a huge improvement over what we have now. And if you doubt it, consider how much theft and thuggery and kidnapping and violence and even murder is committed in the name of law. That would immediately go away. Because most of the people who carry out that stuff only do it because they believe in authority and they think that, well, I'm just doing my job. When I kidnap this person and steal his stuff because we caught him with a plant that the politicians said he wasn't allowed to have. You're an evil bastard. And in normal life, you wouldn't have done that. But you believe in law and order, meaning let's idiotically enforce whatever stupid arbitrary whim the politicians dream up this week. That doesn't lead to order. It doesn't lead to peace. It doesn't lead to civilization and morality. It leads to violent conflict and injustice. Whereas in that case, if you compare lawlessness to the war on drugs, lawlessness is way more orderly and moral and just than the law enforcement of the war on drugs. And I could use, a dozen other examples of stupid laws, taxation and extortion all over the place that make everything worse. So, it's a testament to how successful the statist indoctrination has been that most people are genuinely scared of the thought of a world in which politicians aren't writing down stupid crap on paper and calling it law. As if that is what makes us civilized and peaceful and moral and treating each other with respect. No, it freaking isn't. It's the exact opposite. It's what pits us against each other, and it's what dupes society into putting up with extortion and violent aggression and a bunch of evil stuff because, well, it was legal and it was done by authority and it was the law, so that makes it okay, right? Wrong. So, if you're scared of a lawless world, look around at the lawful world with lots and lots of law enforcers and lawmakers and literally the mass murder that has happened in the last century and 2 centuries. You can go back as many centuries as you want. And the extortion and everything else. That is what law does more often than not, is it legitimizes immoral, violent aggression. If you do away with that, it doesn't make everybody suddenly not care about being victimized. It doesn't make them not care about morality and not care about their neighbors. All it does is remove the biggest excuse for immoral, violent aggression. So, hooray for lawlessness. Not what most people think that would mean, but what it would actually mean in a society of people who would suddenly have to grow up and act like adults instead of these stupid little idiot children of a bunch of tyrants.
There are already private police organizations existing in this world which have track records infinitely better than government police and which use not escalation of force but de-escalation of force in order to deal with tensile and potentially violent and dangerous situations. The first guy that comes to mind is Dale Brown of Detroit Threat Management Center. If you haven't heard of this guy, YouTube him. Absolutely inspiring and amazing stuff. Another thing I forgot to point out is that the public police actually have no legal responsibility to protect you. Check out this DC court case ruling here, and check out private police groups around the country. Just like the road contractors and stuff, there's a plethora of them. So I'll let you guys check that out for yourselves. Okay, Graham, that's nice. We understand that private companies build roads and can build roads, and we understand that there are private police. But who's going to coordinate all this? Who will keep order? Who's going to make the rules? Don't we need to have a uniform set of rules governing everybody? Isn't that going to be confusing if you travel from one town to another and one town has some rules and another town has different rules? Well, I got a news flash for you guys. It's already like that. There's already different rules in different states and different towns. So, what's the problem with that? Who will arbitrate the rules? Well, no one has the exact answer, but being that we don't live in a totally, I mean, it's pretty goddamn totalitarian, but we don't live in a totally totalitarian state right now. There are already private organizations that offer private conflict resolution services and dispute resolution organizations which offer these things in the private sector, and people do utilize them, and here is a list of them now. So my question to you guys is, if all these things are already extant and already in existence and already around, why can't we switch over from a societal model which elevates violence to the position of a necessary prerequisite for peace, switch over from that model to a model which is actually based on ethical standards and foundations, which says it is always wrong to violate another peaceful human being? Why not switch over? Do we advocate immorality? Do the ends justify the means? Finally, how does this work? Who will make the rules? Even let's just isolate one community in a stateless model. Who's going to make the rules? Let's talk about ownership of yourself and ownership of land. So the people that will make the rules are the people that live in the community and own the land. Can human beings own land? Yes. This is a necessity and a necessary prerequisite for any peaceful society. Why? Because resources are scarce. We already operate under the assumption that people can own things today, and this is necessary for peace. How do people own land? First, you own your body. We can all agree on that. You have the sole right to its operation as far as nature is concerned. If you see a piece of land and it's just wilderness, no one has done anything to it, and you decide to turn it into something or to alter it or to change it through using your body's labor to, say, cut down some trees and build a house, that land, by nature's law, is yours because you have altered it with your body. We all agree on this, if not explicitly, at least implicitly. And I'll give you an example. When you go to McDonald's and order some French fries, and you sit down and some stranger comes up and takes those fries from you, you're going to not be happy with that social interaction. And the reason is, you paid money which you earned using this body's labor and movement, which you created from your own, the body that you own. You earned that money using the body that you own to buy French fries. You get those French fries. Without the body that you owned, you would not have been able to get the money, and thus you would not have been able to purchase those French fries. Thus, for all intents and purposes, they are yours. When another individual who did not work for that money or those fries takes them from you, it's a violation. Some of you may say, yeah, there's nothing like that. That's just an opinion, that nature is wild and the universe doesn't care and I'm a nihilist. Well, that's fine, but you still live by these norms and property standards every day, whether you admit it or not. So when I have a piece of land and I use my body to alter it and no one else has claimed it, by natural law, by the norm of property and self-ownership, it has to be mine. If we don't have these norms, society will descend into chaos. Because resources such as land, wood, everything else is scarce. And without a societal norm, such as property and self-ownership, peace will be impossible. Because there will be people saying, this is mine and this whole region is mine. I'm going to call it the USA. It's all mine and my buddies. We're just a tiny group of people. That doesn't work. It is demonstrably impractical. It cannot be put into practice. So community leaders will agree on these laws, the rules to govern their community. That means we can have private police, lots of different private police. You know, the same way if a pizza joint serves you shitty pizza, you say, I'm not going to that place anymore. Well, if you get private police that end up shooting you in the arm because your taillight was out, you say, you know what, screw them. And the beautiful thing is, in the free market society, they don't have the protection of the government. They don't get to investigate themselves. They're out to make money. And when people see them shoot a guy in the arm for a taillight being out, everyone's going to stop using their business. Everyone's going to stop using their business. You say, yeah, but Graham, won't warlords take over? Won't the people with the most resources just hoard everything? Well, think about it. You don't have a government defending those companies anymore and legitimizing them or punishing people for defending themselves against them. If I defend myself against a cop, I'm going to get punished. In a private law society, no such centralized organization exists. Thus, the beauty of freedom. Decentralize everything. And again, that argument's silly because won't warlords take over? Look around now. Warlords are in power. If that's, as they say, if that's your best argument against anarchism, it's safe to say you've already lost the debate. Finally, guys, there's so much to talk about, and I'm getting lost in my own thoughts here. For those of you interested in anarchism, I thank you for watching this. This is why an anarchist society, a consentist voluntary society, is not only feasible, not only possible, but likely, and the only moral and ethical option. Are you sick of fucking feeling like a bird in a cage? Do you think something's wrong with you because you wake up and you're disappointed with the way the world is? You think maybe something's wrong with me, but I just don't feel happy with this whole system. Everyone just seems like a fucking rat in a cage. You're not alone. We're human. This is amazing. You're an amazing human being. It's not wrong that you feel fucking pissed off about this shit. You're free. That's why it bothers you. So, that's it in a nutshell. You either believe in violence or you believe in peace. You either believe violence is necessary for peace or you believe peace is necessary for peace. And peace includes self-defense. Don't forget that. Because I think you'll find once you start to ask questions that it's actually not the anarchist that is the utopian idealist. It is the statist who implicitly believes that some humans, for some arbitrary reason, have godlike powers and divine rights to exercise oppressive control and make other human beings who are no different by nature their slaves. Are you following me? It's really fucking insane, guys.
Government is not a necessary evil. It is inherently evil, and it is not necessary, as we have shown through the course of this video. And you can see it through many examples. You can see that the same exact arguments made for slavery are the same exact arguments made for government. You can see my video, 144 Proofs Government Should Not and Does Not Exist. You can see my other video talking about slavery and how the modern form of slavery is this knowledge of government. Not the knowledge thereof, but the obedience to government, which is called statism. Statism is what creates government. That is the real culprit, not the government itself. It's not a they versus us scenario. We are battling our own kind here. And we must understand that, yes, freedom isn't free, and that in order to attain a free world in the first place, people must have knowledge of morality. People must be the change and start to become responsible and learn how to do so. This is why it's considered the one great work. It takes an enormous amount of effort in getting past ignorance and roadblocks as such like ego, so we can bring the education that is necessary for freedom to align with natural law, the only law that exists, right? If we're going to use the word law, essentially principles. And these principles, these laws are with us, and it's just a matter of if we abide to them. Because anarchy is all around us. It's the given reality present, as you have learned, so it is something to the matter of which our actions depend on our harmonization. Okay, so what you put into the world is what will come out of it. This is the law of attraction. This is a simple natural law. Just for example, I encourage you to learn more about this at nita.one. And it's important to note that truth rises above naturally. People are to have opinions of their own and their own ways of doing things in life. In fact, the world without government is the world where one person's opinion is not pushed upon another. And so truth will rise above naturally if natural medicine is supposed to be used or other things. There's an abundant billions of reasons why a world without government is better, as not just listed in the 144, just as it was mentioned in the 144 Proofs video. It's also mentioned in my video talking about how learning the law would change the world forever.
Now, it's either learning natural law or learning the nature of statism, learning the nature of government, learning the nature of ourselves. Notice we're learning the nature of the whole world around us, and over time these natures grow clear because, again, the truth comes clear. We see the nature of government over time as we see democide and the consequences to our actions occur. We see the law of attraction in progress. We see natural law, which consists of the good and the bad. We see the bad side of it so we can then understand what we need to do for the good side of it. And so, like I said, education is important. Nature is important. Nature is the answer, and nature isn't perfect. I said, the title of this video is understanding that this is as perfect a society as we can get. Yes, that means optimal. This is as optimal as a society we can get, as sustainable as a society that we can with nature, okay? With nature directly, so that, we can really reap what we sow, and we could truly reach the destinies that we want to reach. There's no limits to our potential. Freedom is possibility. And that's where you see creativity come in. And creativity is so important, not just for the freedom that we desire, but in keeping that freedom. Like I said, the same things that are going to maintain the freedom that we have are the same things that will create it. It's mass amounts of individuals coming together to understand these ideas and then upholding it through the generations. And my website, Nita.one, really brings together, this transitional process of how we can do it step by step. And it's very, very simple. It's simply a matter of awareness and bringing it to people's attention so that the knowledge is in circulation and people put it into practical application. And so keep in mind the transition there and how we can really transition to living in a world more in abidance to nature, to what is, the real anarchy, which is all around us, simply living more aligned and using private law and common law to help us in our efforts, whether, toward freedom or within the state of freedoms. Keep in mind, freedom, being anarchy, being nature, is all around us. It's just a matter of how much it's embraced and how much it is used. Okay, this is the real state of nature, understanding the nature of how human beings act in the real world without the government, and we see that it actually works out quite well. It's important to know that those who seek control and power will create and or aggregate problems in order to create and or maintain government. Okay, so if they see a problem with transitioning the world toward anarchy or people waking up, they're going to point that out and say, hey, that's a reason why we shouldn't move toward this. Of course, the power control centers of the world will want to keep on to their power, so they may use violence to do so, but keep in mind, you have the self-defense principle. All this is kept into fruition when it comes to transitioning society. And government's falling does not equate to anarchy being chaos, as especially those within the fallen government will still believe in government's very existence, and natural law goes unrecognized. Okay, so it's important that we get rid of the belief in statism. That's what we're attacking here. It's not government. Okay, and when we talk about anarchy, again, it's not no rules, it means no rulers by its own definition. And many problems are in fact created with government, often the same problems we claim government is the solution toward. And I think that is the main conclusion that you can come upon with this video. So thank you very much for watching, and please look at all the resources that you see on the screen. There's so much out there that people have looked into and worked on, and this is what the internet can do, is it can free us in the real world and be a beneficial guiding tool for the real world so we can truly achieve what we want to achieve. We are interconnected. Anything is possible. Use the technology to your benefit. Use all the resources to your benefit. And most importantly, bring knowledge to people. Put it out there in the real world. Get the conversation going. If that's, that's the least we can do. The reason why everything works better without government is because that is the way things are meant to be naturally. We are to be doing certain things naturally and staying to according our nature, right? And that is living in abidance to our nature. It is respecting it. It is harmonizing with it. It is therefore being there of the law. And understanding the law, shall we understand our actions so we know its implications. And when we understand, okay, what causes millions of deaths versus what doesn't, what causes violence versus what doesn't, we're understanding the greatest ability that we have, which is human willpower. And we need to use that to our ability. We don't want to lose it and give it away. We don't want to give away our responsibility. We want to be responsible. We want to be sovereign. We want to be free. But in order to be free, we have to be sovereign. In order to be responsible, we need to guide each other. In order to have freedom, we need to guide each other. We're all still part of the process here with one another. The problem is us putting it in certain people's hands and saying it's their responsibility, they have to do it for us, when it's always your own responsibility and it's your own nature. Protect your nature, defend your nature, stand for your nature, use your nature so you don't lose your nature. Nature is the answer, do not forget it. Thank you very much. This is Cory, Edmund, Endrulat. Nature is the answer. Nita.1, Nita.one.